The year was 2287 and humanity had finally done it. After centuries of dreaming about the stars and decades of failed experiments, they had cracked faster than light travel. The discovery changed everything overnight. Suddenly, Earth was not alone anymore, and the radio signals they had been picking up for years were not just noise, but actual conversations between hundreds of alien species scattered across the Milky Way galaxy. Captain Daniel Hayes stood on the bridge of the horizon's edge and watched the massive space station grow larger on the view screen. Zenith Point was unlike anything humanity had ever built. The station stretched for miles in every direction with docking ports that could accommodate ships of wildly different designs. Some vessels looked like organic creatures with smooth curves and bioluminescent panels, while others were purely geometric with sharp angles and crystalline surfaces that caught the light of nearby stars. Daniel was 42 years old, with gray starting to show at his temples and lines around his eyes from years of squinting at star charts. He had been a naval officer before joining the new Space Exploration Corps, and he carried that military bearing with him even now. His uniform was crisp and dark blue with the Earth insignia on his shoulder and a small American flag patch on his chest. Next to him stood Commander Lisa Martinez, who served as his tactical officer. She was younger at 35, with sharp, intelligent eyes and black hair pulled back in a tight bun. Lisa had been a fighter pilot before the FTL breakthrough, and she still moved with that same coiled energy, like she was always ready for action. Down in engineering, Chief Kevin Brooks was running final checks on their systems. Kevin was a big man with broad shoulders and calloused hands from years of working with machinery. He had worked on deep space mining rigs before this assignment, and he knew how to keep a ship running even when everything was falling apart. The Horizon's Edge was humanity's first real diplomatic vessel. She was not the biggest ship Earth had built, but she was the most important. Her hull was painted white with blue accents, and her design tried to look peaceful and approachable. There were no visible weapons, though the crew knew there were a few defensive systems hidden in the hull plating just in case. The mission was simple in theory, but terrifying in practice. Make contact with the Galactic Council, present humanity's credentials, and try to join the cosmic community without making any catastrophic mistakes. The crew had spent 2 years preparing for this moment, studying alien languages and customs that had been pieced together from intercepted transmissions. They knew the Council had been around for thousands of years, and that hundreds of species participated in it. They knew that the galaxy operated on principles of diplomacy and peaceful negotiation. Violence was considered primitive and barbaric. Wars were ancient history solved millennia ago through enlightened cooperation. Daniel felt the weight of 6 billion people on his shoulders as the Horizon's Edge approached the docking port. One wrong word or gesture could doom humanity to isolation or worse. The docking procedure went smoothly, with the station's automated systems guiding them into place. When the airlock sealed and the atmosphere equalized, Daniel took a deep breath and straightened his uniform. Lisa and Kevin joined him along with 6 other crew members who would serve as the diplomatic party. They stepped through the airlock and into a whole new world. Zenith Point's interior was breathtaking. The main concourse was enormous, with ceilings that soared hundreds of feet overhead. Holographic displays floated in the air, showing trade information and news from across the galaxy. Beings of every imaginable shape and size moved through the space. Some walked on 2 legs like humans, while others slithered or floated or moved on 6 or 8 limbs. The air had a slightly sweet smell, and the gravity felt just a touch lighter than Earth normal. A delegation waited for them near the entrance. The leader was tall and slender, with pale blue skin and large dark eyes. She wore flowing robes that seemed to shift colors as she moved. This was Ambassador Velthara of the Kin species, and she would be humanity's guide into galactic society. Velthara greeted them with a gesture that the crew had learned meant peaceful welcome. Daniel returned it carefully and offered his hand for a handshake. Velthara looked at the hand curiously, then gently touched it with her 3-fingered hand. Her skin felt cool and dry. The ambassador led them through the station, explaining various sites and introducing them to other species. Everyone they met seemed curious about the newcomers. Humans were young by galactic standards. Most species had been traveling the stars for thousands of years, some for millions. Earth had only just arrived at the party. They reached a grand chamber where the formal welcome ceremony would take place. Delegates from dozens of species had gathered to meet the humans. The chamber was circular with a raised platform in the center. Daniel and his crew stood on the platform while Velthara presented humanity's petition to join the council. She spoke in a melodic language that was automatically translated through small devices the humans wore in their ears. She talked about Earth's achievements and potential contributions to galactic civilization. Daniel felt pride swelling in his chest. They had made it. Humanity was going to join something bigger than themselves. Then everything went wrong. The explosion came without warning. The far wall of the chamber burst inward in a shower of debris and flame. Alarms screamed throughout the station. Through the breach came ships, small fast attack craft with weapons already firing. The delegates scattered in panic. Daniel saw beings cut down by energy weapons before they could reach cover. Lisa grabbed his arm and pulled him toward a support pillar. Kevin was already moving to shield the other crew members. The attackers were boarding the station now. Daniel got his first clear look at them. They were massive beings that stood at least 7 feet tall with thick armored hides and 4 arms. Each arm held a weapon. Their faces were brutal with small eyes and mouths full of sharp teeth. They moved through the chamber with terrible purpose, shooting anything that moved. Daniel recognized them from the briefing materials. These were Kraviks, pirates and raiders known for their brutality, but they had never attacked a council station before. This was unprecedented. The Kraviks moved to a group of small furry beings huddled in the corner. These were Mela, a peaceful trader species known for their gentle nature. The Kraviks opened fire without hesitation. Daniel watched in horror as adults threw themselves over their children trying to protect them. It made no difference. The energy weapons cut through them all. He saw a small Mela child no bigger than a human toddler take a direct hit. The child's body collapsed like a puppet with cut strings. Lisa had her sidearm out, but Daniel put his hand on her arm. There were too many Kraviks and they were too far away. Engaging now would just get his crew killed. He forced himself to watch and remember every detail. The massacre lasted less than 5 minutes. Then as quickly as they had come, the Kraviks retreated to their ships. They dragged several bodies with them, including some of the dead, Mela. Their ships pulled away from the station and jumped to FTL before anyone could react. The chamber was silent, except for the sound of alarms and quiet sobbing. Daniel stepped out from behind the pillar. Bodies lay scattered across the floor. Blood in various colors pooled on the pristine white surface. He counted at least 30 dead, including 5 Mela children. Station security forces finally arrived, but they had been too slow. They had not even tried to engage the Kraviks. They had simply waited for the raiders to leave. Ambassador Velthara appeared looking shaken but composed. She approached Daniel with what he now recognized as deep sadness in her large eyes. She explained that the Council's security forces had followed protocol. When faced with overwhelming force, they retreated to preserve lives and would now begin negotiations with the Kraviks to determine appropriate reparations and prevent future incidents. This was the civilized way. This was how the galaxy handled conflict. Daniel stared at her. He looked down at the body of the small Mela child lying in a pool of purple blood. He looked at his crew. Lisa's face was hard as stone. Kevin's jaw was clenched so tight Daniel could see the muscles jumping. The other crew members looked sick and angry. These were good people. They had joined the space program to explore and discover and bring humanity into a bright new future. Instead, they had witnessed a slaughter. Daniel turned back to Velthara. His voice was quiet, but it carried clearly in the sudden silence. Every being in the chamber turned to listen. His words were simple and cold, and they would echo across the galaxy in the days to come. He said, "We don't negotiate with murderers." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Ambassador Velthara stepped back as if Daniel had struck her. Around the chamber, other delegates began murmuring in their various languages. The translation devices in the human crew's ears buzzed with overlapping conversations, but the tone was clear. Shock and disapproval radiated from every alien present. Velthara composed herself and spoke carefully. She explained that Daniel must understand the gravity of what he was suggesting. The Galactic Council had maintained peace for 10,000 years through diplomacy and negotiation. Violence was the tool of primitive species who had not yet evolved beyond their baser instincts. The Kraviks would be contacted and a mediation process would begin. Reparations would be paid to the families of the victims. Guarantees would be extracted to prevent future incidents. This was how civilization worked. Daniel listened without interrupting. When she finished, he asked a simple question. How many times have the Kraviks done this before? Velthara hesitated. Her pale blue skin seemed to darken slightly. She admitted that the Kraviks had been involved in several incidents over the past century. Each time the Council had successfully negotiated a peaceful resolution. Daniel asked how many beings had died in those incidents. Velthara did not answer directly but said that every death was tragic and that the Council worked tirelessly to minimize loss of life through diplomatic channels. Lisa Martinez spoke up for the first time. Her voice was hard and controlled. She asked who paid the reparations. Did the Kraviks compensate the victims or did the Council pay from some general fund? Velthara explained that typically the affected species would contribute to a settlement fund, which would then be used to satisfy the Kraviks' demands and prevent further violence. Lisa laughed, but there was no humor in it. She said so the victims pay their own murderers to stop killing them. Velthara insisted that Lisa was oversimplifying a complex diplomatic process. Daniel had heard enough. He told Velthara that humanity would not be participating in any negotiations with the Kraviks. Instead, they would be leaving the station immediately to track down the raiders. Velthara's large eyes widened in alarm. She said that was absolutely forbidden. If humanity took aggressive action against another species, they would be barred from the Galactic Council permanently. They would be marked as a dangerous species and potentially quarantined to their own solar system. The consequences would be catastrophic for Earth's future in the galaxy. Daniel nodded slowly. He understood the stakes. Then he turned to his crew and asked for a show of hands, who wanted to follow Council protocol and wait for diplomacy to run its course. Not a single hand went up. He asked who wanted to hunt down the Kraviks and make them pay for what they had done. Every hand shot up instantly. Kevin Brooks said what they were all thinking. Those things killed children. They murdered innocent people who could not fight back. If the Council would not do anything about it, then humanity would. The human delegation walked back to their ship. Velthara followed them, pleading and reasoning and warning. She genuinely seemed to care about humanity's future, but she could not understand why they would throw it all away for revenge. Daniel stopped at the airlock and turned to face her one last time. He said it was not about revenge. It was about justice. There was a difference, and apparently the galaxy had forgotten what that difference was. Humanity had not forgotten. They had learned it the hard way through centuries of bloody history. Sometimes the only way to stop evil was to destroy it. The Horizon's Edge undocked from Zenith Point within the hour. The Council sent urgent messages demanding they return, but Daniel ignored them all. He gathered his crew in the common area. There were 43 people on board, ranging from scientists to engineers, to the small security team that served as their protection. Daniel explained the situation clearly. If they proceeded with this mission, they would be defying the Galactic Council. Earth might disavow them. They might never be allowed to return home. Their names would be remembered as the humans who destroyed Earth's chance at joining galactic civilization. Anyone who wanted to leave could take a shuttle back to the station right now with no judgment or consequences. Nobody moved. A young technician named Chris Palmer spoke up. He was only 24 and had been excited about meeting aliens since he was a child. He said he joined the space program to explore and make first contact. But if making contact meant watching children get murdered and doing nothing about it, then he wanted no part of that galaxy. Better to be alone than to be complicit in evil. The crew erupted in agreement. Lisa Martinez took charge of the tactical situation. She accessed the station's sensor logs from the attack. The Kraviks had been sloppy and confident. They had not bothered to mask their departure vector. She tracked their FTL signature and determined they had jumped toward the Viridian Nebula. That region was largely unexplored with thick dust clouds that interfered with sensors. Perfect place for a hidden base. Kevin Brooks started work on the ship immediately. The Horizon's Edge had been designed for exploration and diplomacy, not combat. But every ship had basic defensive systems, and Kevin was a genius at improvisation. He repurposed the mining lasers they carried for asteroid sampling. He reinforced the hull with spare plating. He even rigged up the shield generators to operate at higher capacity than their design specs allowed. It would burn them out eventually, but it might keep them alive long enough to matter. The flight to the Viridian Nebula took 3 days. During that time, the crew trained constantly. The security team ran combat drills. The scientists studied everything known about Kravik's biology, looking for weaknesses. Lisa worked on tactical scenarios. She knew they were massively outgunned, but humans had won battles against superior forces before. It required creativity, and a willingness to take risks that a more cautious species might avoid. On the second day, a council ship intercepted them. It was a sleek diplomatic vessel twice the size of the Horizon's Edge. The captain identified himself as Ambassador Torvan of the Sec species. His species were reptilian with green scales and vertical slit pupils. He appeared on their view screen looking stern and disapproving. He ordered the humans to stand down immediately and return to Zenith Point to face judgment for their violations of council law. Daniel refused politely but firmly. Torvan's expression hardened. He said the humans were behaving like children playing with weapons they did not understand. The Kraviks were dangerous, but they could be managed through proper channels. What the humans were attempting was suicide, and would only make the situation worse. Daniel asked Torvan to access his computer and review the files on Kravik's activity over the past century. He wanted the ambassador to see the pattern for himself. Torvan was silent for a long moment as he reviewed the data. His face remained impassive, but Daniel saw something flicker in those reptilian eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or shame. The record showed 17 separate Kravik's raids over the past 100 years. Each time they attacked civilian targets. Each time they killed indiscriminately. Each time the council negotiated and paid them to stop. And each time the Kraviks took the payment and eventually did it again. The intervals between attacks were getting shorter. The death tolls were rising. The pattern was clear to anyone willing to see it. Daniel asked Torvan how many more attacks would be acceptable. How many more dead children before the council admitted their diplomatic approach was not working. The ambassador had no answer. Daniel leaned forward in his chair. He said the council could do whatever they wanted to humanity after this was over. They could quarantine Earth or declare humans an enemy species or whatever else they felt was necessary. But right now, those Kravik's raiders were flying toward their base, confident that nobody would come after them, confident that they could kill with impunity because the galaxy was too civilized to fight back. Daniel intended to prove them wrong. Torvan stared at Daniel for a long time. Finally, he spoke quietly. He said the Sec species had once been warriors. Thousands of years ago, they had solved conflicts through strength and combat. The council had civilized them and taught them the value of peaceful negotiation. In all those centuries, Torvan had never once questioned whether that change had been for the better. Until now. He asked what Daniel planned to do when he found the Kravik's base. Daniel's answer was simple and cold. He said, "We're going to end them. All of them." Torvan closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them again, he said he could not support this action, and he would report it to the council. But he would not try to stop the humans. He would give them a 12-hour head start before sending his report. It was the most he could do without violating his oath to the council. Daniel thanked him and the transmission ended. The Horizon's Edge entered the Viridian Nebula at maximum speed. The thick dust clouds immediately began interfering with their sensors just as Lisa had predicted. They would have to search carefully and methodically. Kevin reported that his modifications were holding, but the ship was already showing stress from the hard travel. They had one shot at this. They had to find the base and hit it before their systems failed, or before a council fleet arrived to stop them. Lisa picked up something on sensors. A faint energy signature deep in the nebula. It could be natural, but the pad A. The Kravik's outpost loomed before them like a mechanical nightmare. It was built into a large asteroid with metal structures jutting out in all directions. Docking ports lined the outer surface, and weapon platforms rotated slowly, scanning for threats. 6 warships were docked there, each one larger and better armed than the Horizon's Edge. The base itself probably held hundreds of Kravik's warriors. Lisa studied the sensor readings and shook her head. She said this was impossible. Even with Kevin's modifications, they could not win a straight fight against those odds. Daniel knew she was right. They needed a different approach. He asked Lisa to focus on the base itself rather than the ships. There had to be a weakness somewhere. She ran deeper scans looking for power signatures and structural vulnerabilities. After 20 minutes, she found something interesting. The entire outpost ran on a centralized power core. It was efficient, but it meant everything was connected to that single source. If they could knock out the power, the base would go dark, and the ships would be unable to launch quickly. Kevin looked at the schematics and said he could build an electromagnetic pulse device, strong enough to overwhelm their power grid. But someone would need to get it inside the base close to the core. The outer hull was too heavily shielded for the pulse to penetrate from outside. They would need to find an access point. Lisa highlighted an exhaust port on her screen. It vented excess heat from the reactor and led directly into the core chamber. The port was small, only about 3 meters wide, but a shuttle could fit through it if the pilot was skilled enough. Chris Palmer volunteered immediately. He was their best shuttle pilot, having logged thousands of hours on mining runs in asteroid fields. Kevin said he would go with Chris to manually trigger the pulse device once they were inside. Daniel wanted to argue, but he knew they were right. This was a 2-person job, and they were the best qualified. While the base was dark, Daniel would lead a boarding team to search for prisoners. The Kravix had taken bodies from the station, and he wanted to know why. If there were survivors, they would get them out. If there were only bodies, they would still get them out. Nobody got left behind. The plan was insane, but it was the only chance they had. Kevin worked for 6 hours straight building the pulse device from spare parts and modified equipment. It was crude, but he guaranteed it would work exactly once before burning itself out. That was all they needed. Chris prepped the smallest shuttle and ran simulations of the approach vector. The exhaust port was surrounded by automated defense turrets. He would have to fly fast and precise with no margin for error. He practiced the route until he could fly it with his eyes closed. Daniel selected 12 crew members for the boarding team. They were mostly security personnel, but also included 2 medics and Lisa, who refused to stay behind. They armed themselves with everything available: standard pulse rifles, cutting tools, emergency medical supplies, and enough explosive charges to level a city block. They wore environment suits with built-in armor plating, not military grade but better than nothing. Daniel gathered them in the shuttle bay and gave them the mission brief. Get in, find the prisoners, get out. Stay together and watch each other's backs. If anyone got separated, the team would not leave without them. The Horizon's Edge moved into position. They stayed at the edge of sensor range, hidden in the thick nebula dust. The Kravix base showed no signs of alertness. Why would they be alert? Nobody had ever attacked them before. The galaxy was too civilized for that. Chris and Kevin climbed into the shuttle. Chris looked nervous but determined. Kevin just looked focused. Daniel clasped hands with both of them. He told them to come back alive. Kevin grinned and said they had not come this far to die in a dusty nebula. The shuttle launched. It accelerated hard toward the base, staying low and fast. The defense turrets activated immediately, tracking the small craft with lethal precision. Chris flew like a demon, weaving between asteroids and debris. Energy blasts lit up the space around them. But Chris was always somewhere else by the time they arrived. He dove and rolled and spun the shuttle in ways that made Kevin grab his restraints with white knuckles. They reached the exhaust port with the turret still firing. Chris did not slow down. He aimed the shuttle directly at the opening and punched the throttle. They shot through the port with less than a meter of clearance on either side. The shuttle scraped against the walls, throwing sparks, but Chris kept it steady. They emerged into a large chamber filled with machinery and conduits. The reactor core pulsed with energy in the center of the room. Kevin was already moving before they landed. He grabbed the pulse device and ran toward the core. Chris stayed with the shuttle, keeping the engines hot for a fast exit. Kevin placed the device against the main power conduit and activated the timer. 30 seconds. He ran back to the shuttle and barely made it inside before Chris launched them back toward the exit. The pulse detonated just as they cleared the exhaust port. Every light on the base went dark instantly. The rotating weapon platforms stopped moving. The docked ships lost power. Emergency lighting flickered on, casting everything in a dim red glow. The Kravix base had just gone blind and deaf. Daniel did not wait. He gave the order, and the Horizon's Edge accelerated toward the base. They targeted a large docking port and fired their mining lasers. The reinforced door melted under the sustained beam. The ship pushed through into the docking bay. Daniel and his team were already in the airlock. The moment the bay pressurized, they were out and moving. The docking bay was huge and empty except for cargo containers and maintenance equipment. They moved in a tight formation with weapons ready. The base was in chaos. Alarms blared and Kravix warriors rushed through corridors trying to understand what had happened. The humans moved quickly and quietly, avoiding contact when possible. They needed to find where the prisoners would be held. Lisa led them deeper into the base, following a mental map she had created from the sensor scans. She guessed that prisoners would be held in the lower levels away from the main operational areas. They descended through access tunnels and maintenance shafts. Twice they encountered Kravix warriors. Both times the fights were brief and brutal. The Kraviks were bigger and stronger, but they were confused and disorganized. The humans fought with precision and overwhelming firepower. They left no survivors. They found the detention area on the third level down. The doors were sealed, but without power, the locks were useless. Kevin had brought cutting tools, and he made short work of the barriers. The smell hit them first. Blood and waste and death. Daniel felt his stomach turn, but he pushed forward. The corridor beyond was lined with cells. Most were empty. Some contained bodies. Then they heard crying. A small voice calling out in a language they did not understand, but the meaning was clear. Someone was alive down here. Lisa ran toward the sound. She found a large cell at the end of the corridor. Inside were 3 Mela children huddled together in the corner. They were filthy and injured, but alive. When they saw Lisa, they shrank back in fear. She removed her helmet and smiled as gently as she could. She said they were here to help, and they were going to take them home. The children did not understand the words, but they understood the tone. One of them reached out a small furry hand. Lisa took it carefully. The medics moved in and started treating the children's injuries. They were malnourished and scared, but they would survive. Daniel searched the rest of the cells. He found 2 adult Mela, both dead. He also found something worse. A laboratory. The Kraviks had been experimenting on their captives. Dissection tables and medical equipment covered in dried blood. Computer terminals displaying biological data. The Kraviks had been harvesting genetic material from the Mela. Their species had natural regenerative abilities, and apparently that was valuable on the black market. They killed entire families to steal their biology. Daniel felt rage like he had never known. This was not just raiding or piracy. This was calculated evil. The Kraviks knew exactly what they were doing. They had done it before, and they would do it again unless someone stopped them. He placed explosive charges throughout the laboratory. Every piece of equipment, every data terminal, every sample container. This place would burn. His radio crackled. Kevin reported that the Kraviks were getting organized. They had backup power coming online in sections of the base. The docked ships were starting to power up. They needed to leave now. Daniel ordered everyone back to the ship. They moved quickly with the children carried by the medics. Kraviks warriors were everywhere now. They had figured out there were intruders, and they were hunting. The humans fought their way through corridor after corridor. One crew member took a hit from an energy weapon. The shot burned through his armor and he went down. 2 others grabbed him and dragged him along. Nobody gets left behind. They reached the docking bay just as the first Kraviks warship began undocking procedures. Daniel's team piled into the horizon's edge. The airlock sealed, and Kevin already had the engines hot. They pulled out of the bay and accelerated away from the base. Behind them, the Kraviks ships were scrambling to launch. 4 of them cleared their docks and began pursuit. Daniel ordered Kevin to get them out of weapons range. He had one more thing to do. He triggered the detonator. The laboratory exploded first. Then the charges. News of the attack spread across the galaxy faster than light itself. Within hours, every species connected to the galactic network knew what had happened. The humans had destroyed a Kraviks outpost. They had killed hundreds of Kraviks warriors. They had violated every principle of galactic civilization. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The Galactic Council convened an emergency session. Representatives from over 1,000 species gathered in the Grand Chamber on Zenith Point. The mood was one of shock and outrage. Many species had never even heard of humans before this week. Now they knew humanity as the violent newcomers who had brought war back to a peaceful galaxy. The horizon's edge returned to Zenith Point, escorted by Council security ships. Daniel had agreed to come back voluntarily to face whatever judgment awaited. The 3 Mela children had been transferred to medical facilities where they were reunited with surviving family members. The reunion had been broadcast across multiple news networks. Images of the children crying and embracing their relatives were shown alongside footage of the destroyed Kraviks base. The galaxy did not know what to think. Some saw heroes who had rescued innocents. Most saw dangerous primitives who had committed mass murder. Daniel stood in the docking bay preparing to face the council. His crew wanted to come with him, but he ordered them to stay on the ship. This was his responsibility as captain. Lisa argued, but Daniel was firm. If the council wanted to punish someone, they would punish him alone. His crew had just followed orders. Lisa called him an idiot and said they had all volunteered. They were all responsible. But Daniel had made up his mind. He walked to the airlock alone. Ambassador Velthara was waiting for him. She looked tired and sad. She said the council was furious and many species were demanding severe punishment for humanity. Earth might be quarantined or even marked as a hostile species to be avoided. Everything humanity had dreamed of achieving in the stars was at risk. Daniel asked if she thought they had done the wrong thing. Velthara was quiet for a long moment. Finally, she said she did not know anymore. She had seen the rescued children. She had read the reports about what the Kraviks had been doing in that laboratory. Part of her was glad they were stopped. But another part of her feared what humanity represented, a return to violence after millennia of peace. The walk to the council chamber felt like a funeral march. Beings from dozens of species lined the corridors watching Daniel pass. Some looked at him with fear, others with curiosity, a few with something that might have been respect. He kept his head high and his stride steady. He had done what he believed was right. He would face the consequences without shame. The council chamber was packed. Every seat was filled, and the holographic platforms held representatives of hundreds more species participating remotely. Daniel walked to the center platform where accused individuals stood for judgment. The chamber fell silent as he took his position. Supreme Arbiter Jendok presided over the proceedings. He was a member of an ancient species called the Tal'un. His form was vaguely humanoid, but his skin had a crystalline quality that caught and reflected light. He had held his position for over 300 years, and his voice carried absolute authority. He began by listing the charges against Daniel Hayes and by extension against humanity. Unauthorized military action against a sovereign entity. Destruction of private property. Murder of 643 Kravik citizens. Violation of the Galactic Peace Accords. Endangerment of galactic stability. The list went on. When Jendok finished, he asked Daniel how he pleaded. Daniel said guilty to all charges if you define them that way, but he did not accept that stopping murderers was a crime. Jendok's crystalline face showed no emotion. He asked if Daniel had anything to say in his defense. Daniel looked around the chamber at the 1,000 faces watching him. He thought about the Mela children and their dead parents. He thought about the laboratory and the genetic experiments. He thought about the 17 previous Kravik's attacks that the council had negotiated away. He began to speak. He told them about Earth's history. He talked about the wars and genocides that had scarred humanity's past. He described how his species had learned hard lessons about evil. He explained that there were some beings who could not be reasoned with or reformed, some beings who viewed mercy as weakness and diplomacy as opportunity. He talked about dictators who had promised peace while building death camps, about terrorists who had used ceasefires to rearm and attack again, about criminals who had exploited every chance at redemption to hurt more victims. Daniel said humanity had learned that sometimes the only moral response to evil was to destroy it completely, not out of hatred or revenge, but out of a duty to protect the innocent. He asked the council how many times the Kraviks would have to attack before they admitted negotiation was not working. How many more children had to die before someone said enough? The council's way might work for species that valued life and peace, but it failed against those who valued neither. The chamber erupted. Dozens of representatives tried to speak at once. Some shouted that Daniel was arrogant to lecture civilizations millions of years old. Others argued that violence only created more violence. A few voices surprisingly suggested that perhaps humanity had a point. Jendok called for order and the chamber slowly quieted. He said that Daniel's speech was passionate, but it did not change the facts. Humanity had committed acts of war and violated the most sacred principles of galactic civilization. The council would now vote on appropriate sanctions. Before the vote could begin, a new voice spoke. It came from a section of the chamber that rarely participated in debates. The Vor delegation had been silent observers for most of recorded galactic history. They were an ancient race even older than the Tal'un. Their representative was named Kethral, and he moved slowly to the speaking platform. His species were tall and thin with 4 arms and skin that shifted between blue and purple. Kethral had not spoken in council for over 50 years. Everyone listened. Kethral told a story. Thousands of years ago, the Vor had been warriors. They had believed in strength and justice through action. They had fought wars against those who threatened the innocent. But the council had civilized them, taught them that violence was primitive, showed them the benefits of negotiation and compromise. The Vor had embraced these teachings and abandoned their warrior culture. They had become peaceful traders and scholars. But in all the centuries since Kethril had watched his species like the Kravix exploited the Council's weakness. He had watched victims pay their own attackers. He had watched evil prosper because good beings were too civilized to fight it. Kethril looked directly at Daniel. He said that humanity remembered something the galaxy had forgotten. That sometimes mercy to the wicked was cruelty to the innocent. That peace bought with the suffering of victims was not peace at all. That civilization did not mean refusing to fight, but rather knowing what was worth fighting for. The Vor had lost that knowledge. Perhaps the galaxy needed a species that still possessed it. The chamber was absolutely silent. Kethril's words carried weight that few others could match. He was not just any representative, but a respected elder of one of the galaxy's founding species. Other voices began to speak. A representative from a small trading species said that piracy along their routes had been a constant threat for decades. Every negotiation with raiders had resulted in temporary peace followed by renewed attacks. A delegate from a mining colony described how they had been attacked 6 times, and each time the council had told them to be patient while negotiations proceeded. More voices joined. Species that had suffered from violence and received only diplomatic platitudes in response. They had been silenced by the weight of galactic consensus, but now someone had given them permission to speak their truth. Ambassador Torvon, the SEC representative, who had intercepted the Horizon's Edge, stood to speak. He said that he had reviewed the records of Kravik's activity extensively. The pattern was undeniable. They attacked, the council negotiated, they accepted payment, and they attacked again. The intervals between attacks were getting shorter. It would have continued indefinitely because the council had no mechanism to stop beings who did not care about diplomacy. Torvon said something remarkable. He said that in the 36 hours since the Kravik's base was destroyed, 3 other pirate groups operating in nearby sectors had contacted the council requesting formal peace treaties. Not negotiating after attacks, but proactively seeking peace. They had heard what happened to the Kraviks. They were afraid. For the first time in living memory, criminals were afraid of consequences. Crime rates in sectors near human activity had dropped by 40%. Ships that had been avoiding certain routes out of fear were now traveling freely. Jendok tried to regain control of the proceedings. He said that fear was not a foundation for lasting peace, that ruling through intimidation was no different than the tyranny they had abolished millennia ago. But his words lacked conviction. The evidence was mounting that humanity's brutal approach had achieved in 2 days what the Council had failed to do in a century. Belthara stood to speak. She looked conflicted but determined. She said she had been assigned to guide humanity into galactic civilization. She had failed in that. 6 months passed since the Council's historic vote, and the galaxy had changed in ways nobody could have predicted. Daniel stood on the bridge of his new flagship, the Retribution, and watched as the last of the human warships arrived at the assembly point. 30 vessels in total, each one purpose-built for combat. Earth had not wasted time after the Council authorized the Galactic Justice Fleet. Shipyards that had been building exploration vessels switched to military production. The ships were not the largest in the galaxy, but they were fast and heavily armed and crewed by humans who understood their mission. Lisa Martinez served as Daniel's second-in-command with the rank of Admiral. She had spent the past months training new crews and establishing tactical protocols. Kevin Brooks led the engineering division, overseeing maintenance and upgrades across the entire fleet. The crew of the original Horizon's Edge had been split up to serve as experienced officers on the new ships. Chris Palmer commanded his own vessel, now a fast attack ship called the Valkyrie. They were no longer explorers or diplomats. They were soldiers, and they wore that identity without shame. The fleet's first real mission came through official channels. A mining colony in the Outer Rim had been attacked by slavers. The colony was operated by a gentle species called the Rendari, who had no military capability. The slavers had struck hard, taking over 200 Rendari workers, including children. They were demanding ransom from the Rendari government and threatening to start killing hostages if payment was delayed. The Galactic Council had opened negotiations as per standard protocol. 3 weeks had passed with no progress. The slavers kept raising their demands, knowing the Council would eventually pay. Finally, after the 5th demand increase, a desperate Rendari delegate had invoked the new provision. They requested human intervention. Daniel read the mission brief carefully. The slaver operation was run by a coalition of species, including some Kravik survivors from the destroyed base. They operated from a fortified station in an asteroid field. Intelligence suggested they held about 500 captives total from various species. The station was heavily defended with automated weapons and at least 3 warships. The Rendari delegate had been very clear in his request. He said his people wanted their workers back and they wanted the slavers stopped permanently. He understood what permanently meant when dealing with humans. The Justice Fleet arrived at the target system in force. The slaver station detected them immediately and broadcast a warning. They threatened to kill hostages if the fleet came closer. Daniel responded with a simple message. Release all captives immediately and surrender or be destroyed. There would be no negotiation and no second warning. The slavers laughed at the ultimatum. They had dealt with the council for decades. Empty threats were meaningless. They killed 3 hostages on camera to prove they were serious. Daniel gave the order. The fleet split into attack groups. Lisa led one force to engage the defending warships. Chris took a strike team to breach the station and secure the hostages. Daniel commanded the main assault. The battle was brief and brutal. Human tactics overwhelmed the slavers who had expected the usual council approach of cautious maneuvering and minimal force. Instead, they got concentrated firepower and aggressive boarding actions. The 3 slaver warships were destroyed within minutes. Lisa's group showed no mercy, taking apart the ships with precision targeting that left no survivors. Chris led his team through the station's docking ports. They moved fast using breaching charges and combat tactics that the slavers had never encountered. The slavers tried to use hostages as shields, but the humans had trained for exactly this scenario. Snipers took precise shots. Assault teams moved with coordination that came from months of drilling. Every slaver who raised a weapon died. Those who surrendered were secured. The hostages were evacuated to transport ships. The entire operation took less than 2 hours from first shot to final clearance. Daniel walked through the captured station afterward. They had rescued 483 beings. 17 hostages had been killed before the humans could reach them. Daniel stood over those bodies and felt the familiar rage. 17 lives that could have been saved if the council had acted sooner. If they had sent the fleet immediately instead of wasting 3 weeks on pointless negotiations. He filed those faces away in his memory. 17 more reasons why humanity's approach was necessary. The slavers who survived the assault were turned over to council authorities for trial. Their station was destroyed. Their assets were seized and distributed as compensation to the victims. More importantly, word spread fast. Humans had been called in and the result was total destruction of the slaver operation. Within days, 3 other slaver networks contacted the council requesting amnesty. They wanted to negotiate terms for releasing their captives and ceasing operations. The council was happy to oblige. The threat of human intervention had achieved what decades of diplomacy could not. More missions followed. A pirate fleet that had terrorized a trade route for years surrendered immediately when human ships appeared. A cartel running illegal weapons to conflict zones dismantled itself rather than face the Justice Fleet. Corrupt governor who had been embezzling aid meant for disaster victims turned himself in when he heard humans were investigating. The pattern repeated across multiple sectors. Criminals who had operated with impunity under the council's gentle justice system were terrified of humanity's direct approach. Not everyone was happy with the changes. Many council species still viewed humans as barbaric enforcers. They argued that ruling through fear was wrong even if it was effective. Several species refused to request human aid even when facing violence. They preferred the old ways of negotiation and compromise. Daniel respected their choice. The Justice Fleet only acted when officially requested. They were not conquerors or vigilantes. They were the option available when peaceful methods failed. The Kravik species underwent dramatic changes. After their military structure was destroyed by humanity, they faced a choice: continue their raiding culture and inevitably face human justice or reform completely. They chose reform. The Kraviks established a new democratic government and petitioned for readmission to the council. They publicly apologized for past attacks and offered reparations to victim species. The transformation was not entirely genuine at first. It was driven by fear. But over time, some Kraviks began to believe in the changes. A new generation grew up knowing that violence would bring swift consequences. They built a different culture. Daniel received an unexpected visitor one day. A young Kravik named Gorith requested a meeting. He was barely an adult by his species standards. He told Daniel that his father had been a warrior at the destroyed base. His father had died in the explosion. Goreth said he had grown up hating humans for taking his father. But as he learned more about what his father had done, and what the base had been used for, his hatred turned to shame. He said his father had been a monster. The humans had stopped him from creating more victims. Goreth wanted to thank Daniel for ending the cycle of violence that had defined Kravik's culture for generations. Daniel did not know what to say. He had killed this young being's father, destroyed his family, changed his entire species' future, but Goreth seemed genuine in his gratitude. He said the old Kravik's way had been evil, and humanity had forced them to find a better path. Daniel accepted the thanks but said he hoped Goreth's generation would build something worthy of the price that had been paid. Goreth promised they would try. 1 year after the first mission, Ambassador Velthara came to the Retribution. She brought data compiled by council analysts. Crime rates across civilized space had dropped by 62%. Piracy was at its lowest level in recorded history. Slaver networks had collapsed. Even petty crimes in council space had decreased as criminals realized the old system of endless appeals and light sentences was gone. If they committed serious crimes, they might face human justice. The deterrent effect was powerful. Velthara said the council wanted to present Daniel with a commendation. The Star of Peace awarded for bringing stability to the galaxy. Daniel almost laughed at the irony. A peace medal for someone who had killed thousands. But he accepted graciously. He understood that the galaxy was slowly accepting a truth humanity had learned long ago. Sometimes peace required the willingness to fight. Sometimes justice required force. Sometimes the only way to protect the innocent was to destroy those who preyed upon them. The ceremony was held on Zenith Point, where everything had started. Representatives from hundreds of species attended. The same chamber where Daniel had been tried for war crimes now celebrated him as a hero. He walked to the platform and accepted the medal from Supreme Arbiter Jendok. The crystalline being looked different somehow, less rigid. He told Daniel that the council had been wrong to dismiss humanity's approach so quickly. There was wisdom in Earth's violent history. Lessons learned through suffering that more peaceful species had never needed to face. Daniel gave a brief speech. He said humanity had not wanted to be warriors. They had hoped to join a peaceful galaxy and leave their violent past behind, but they could not stand by while innocents suffered. He said the Justice Fleet would always be available when needed, but he hoped